On a sunny day, in Miami, USA, a man wakes up, then picks up his phone. His friend on the other side shouts at him saying that he had finally picked up his phone. He says that the representative from the Cybercorp had been waiting for him a while ago. As it's happening, two girls wake up from the noise. Before he ends the call, his friend tells him that he's supposed to meet him today and that he can't be late. After that, the girls clung onto him and invited him to have another fun night like they did last night. At the same time, Seong remembers the time when he got drunk that night. He had a gambling session with another businessman by playing a game of poker. His assistant was trying to get him to settle his affair with the Cybercorp, but Seong was already drunk and got his mind stuck in the game, so he told his assistant to take care of it instead. After the dream, Seong asks his assistant where the representative was, and he says that the man has been waiting for him for half an hour in the reception room. After the call, he tells his bodyguard Paul to prepare for leave, and they get outside and into their chopper. And for their next stop, it's New York. Inside the Core Fund headquarters, Seong and his assistant walked along the hallways on the way to the reception room. His assistant shows him a book of their Cybercorp's collected information from last week. He doesn't want to take a look at it and says that he'll just meet the guy in the reception room instead. Seong enters the room to see the businessman standing by the window. He then apologizes for being late. The businessman thought he had made it through the day before finally meeting him. Seong was busy because their field of operation had to read a lot of data every day, so in that case, he used some substance to help maintain his excitement. The businessman then realized that he had taken some medications and later overslept in the morning. After that, his assistant shows Seong a letter of intent insisting that the Cybercorp will be giving them $20 trillion as their contract deal. But to his surprise, Seong slams the paper and says that he'll have to decline his offer and that he'll have to wait for another opportunity. This then made the businessman upset and begged for him to reconsider that his cooperation with Cybercorp is beneficial but harmless and that he'll provide him with the necessary support. Just after that, Seong denies his offer and laughs at him. The businessman then added that world power, wealth and violence are interdependent and that core funds don't have enough allies in other areas. Seong tells him to stop from there and says that he can accept the two things, but not violence since they're not even arm dealers. After that, he walks away and hopes that he'll still remember him even after a month passes. Seong then teases him and tells him to close the door on his way out. The businessman looked away in vexation and he eventually left the room. His assistant then asks him why he would offend him. Seong thought that he couldn't accept a harmful cartel that inflates the price of medicines. After the meeting, Seong got off his seat and said that their company isn't lacking funds and doesn't want to form a partnership with a shady corporation. Later at the bar, the assistant took a break and had a drink. At his side, a man ordered a glass of whiskey and stated that he's lucky to have a boss like Seong. He then turns to his side and sees that it's the businessman from the reception room earlier and he wants to talk some business with him. Later that same night, a couple bandits ran around Seong's mansion. He notices the disturbance outside his home, so he tells his bodyguard Paul to take a look, but at that same silence, Paul and his partner are knocked off their senses completely. Seong looks out the window but he finds no sign of his men, and at the same time, the bandits sneak up behind him and quickly make work of him. After fading into darkness, he is revealed again a month later looking dehydrated and very stressed. In front of him was the shady businessman from the reception room. A muscle guy pins Seong's head down to the ground. He asks if he's the one that brought him here. He denies it and says he isn't capable of any of that. He then introduces his partner from the Cybercorp named Donnie Leva. He states that the gadget that he used to cheer himself up was flowing into the US from Mexico through his hands. Seong chuckles a bit and finds it ridiculous that Brazil's medical group and Mexico's drug traffickers have now formed a partnership. And now he's confused at what good he'll find in tying him up and forcing him to comply by taking control of his core fund. After the statement, the businessman then points out to him his one mistake, which is that he had no control over the core funds from the start. Donnie then shows him a clip of a person who's being interviewed. A bunch of reporters approach Mr. Rhodes, Seong's assistant, and informs him of the death of his boss due to a drug overdose, and the other reporter wonders if he'll be the head of the core fund. After that, Seong was left baffled by this. Then the businessman mocked him, saying he's now looking for a new core fund leader. He then grits his teeth after realizing that he's been plotting this whole time. The business says to him that he simply gave Rhodes an opportunity that he can't possibly miss. Xiang then questions him on how exactly the core is worth this much effort. The businessman turns around and tells him that this simply meant little to him, then reminds him of what he said a month ago. After that, he steps on his head and tells Xiang that he wasn't obliged to deny him without the support of violence. After a moment of silence, he tells his muscle guys to pick him up and take him away. Donnie then asks him what he's going to do with Xiang, and the businessman tells him that he's going to hand him over to the lab. Inside the operating room, Xiang is seen held down lying on his chest while a doctor performs surgery. The doctor brings up the scalpel, and as soon as he cuts the skin open, he freaks out from his bed and surges with pain. The doctor then tells the other one to inject him with the anesthetic dose, and after calming him down, they continued the operation. He was later left in the room with all his face covered up with bandages. On day 7, in a gathering room, a doctor was talking to his colleagues about how they would adopt simple and effective means of monopolizing knowledge and rising channels, but this type of approach has become increasingly irrelevant in today's time. He adds that the gap between civilians and the elites is reducing, and with the spread of knowledge, there will be more chances for society to launch an upward influence. But despite the slim chances, as long as the conditions are met, a bottom family is expected to achieve a class jump within 3 generations. From there, it is possible for millions of families to give birth to upstarts who compete with them in the upper class. After that, a man speaks up and points out to him that the purpose of this speech is to sell them weapons to shoot unsatisfactory country bumpkins. The doctor denies it, and instead he shows them their latest project. He then reveals that a week ago, his partner had delivered him an extraordinary experimental material. This man stood out for him, and he says that this person shows a very calculating personality and has exhibited outstanding mathematical talent and financial knowledge. Down in that room, Xiang can be seen doing an oil painting. The doctor's audience was shocked to see that a man such as him was capable of making art. He then says he was able to do so because their technology has provided him with master-level artistic skills. The black-haired dude then asks him how he did it, and he says that he accomplished it through a minor operation and the transplantation of a piece of memory. 5 days ago, Xiang was seen sitting on the hospital bed. A doctor then came into the room and asked how he'd been feeling. Xiang then replied with another question and asked him instead what he'd done to him. He said that he'd only done a minor operation on him. He began feeling the back of his neck, and we can see that on that side, there appears to be a coin slot that had been installed after the operation. The peach-headed doctor informs him that after the operation, they took away all his talent and knowledge in mathematics and finance. Xiang then tells him that he can't be making jokes at this moment, but the doctor implies that he has good proof of it. After that, Xiang attempted to think of a bunch of numbers and began calculating, but sadly, everything in his mind was really blurry and he failed as a result. And after failing to process the numbers, Xiang got really upset and asked the doctor how he did it. In the past few years, they've stumbled upon the areas of the human brain that are responsible for managing and storing talents and their related knowledge, so it was on that operation that they based their discovery. Later in the control panel, the peach-headed doctor goes over to their boss doctor. He wonders how Xiang has been feeling. The doctor informs him that he's finally accepted the truth, and he then says that he wants to put Xiang into chip testing and replace the previous test subject. Later that day, Xiang is in another room and is given another chip. This talent chip was the company's new design. This chip also contains all the skills of the violin master Akado, and he wanted Xiang to test it. This then made Xiang realize that his knowledge had also been stored inside one of the chips. The doctor confirmed it, then reminded him of the current user of his chip, none other than Mr. Rhodes. After that, Xiang goes into thinker mode, and at the same time, the doctor also thought that Xiang has shown quite an exceptional ability to regulate emotions. Their previous subjects exhibited uncontrollable responses and were quite difficult to communicate with. After that, Xiang asks how he's supposed to use the chip, and the doctor tells him to insert it into the card slot on the back of his head. Later, he prepares Xiang for another chip test. They give him the violin, and the doctor then tells him to empty his mind and follow only his instincts, because now, he's the world's best violinist. He picks up the violin, the room goes quiet, and then the play ensues. During that play, outside the room, Mr. Hemingway tells his assistant to send an invitation to their partners and show them something in the next 4 days. Back in the present, Xiang is seen painting in the room. He's finally figured out the motives of the staff who work for the company. Their research is roughly divided into 2 parts. First is that they look for elites with unique talents and knowledge, and second, they artificially extract that knowledge and skill from their brains. And for the other part, to transfer these talents, the scientists had to extract them through the means of human modification in order to load them into the chips. Xiang then remembered what the doctor had told him before testing. He said that tomorrow they would have big shots as their spectators and watch the progress of their project. He then instructed him that he shouldn't do or say something unnecessary. A man by the window was impressed after seeing that they'd extracted such a talent from the painter Mr. Leffiel, and after making the chip, he just lent it straight to a stranger. The hooded man then asks if anyone can use the chip, then anyone could do it. Mr. Hemingway then says that it is possible as long as there are no serious defects. Seeing as they're impressed, a man suddenly jumps in and asks him if they can use the chips to somehow cultivate battlefield veterans in bulk. Mr. Hemingway then says that it can also be done as long as the chips are enough. The soldier then requests that he prove it to him and he will give him their full support of the project. Later that day, a new program was established called the Ultimate Fight Show. The first contender is Xiang Shang, the proud son from the streets. His caller then instructs him that this will be a practical test of the killer chip and tells him to prepare himself. The second contender is a heavyweight champion from Pelican Bay Prison, who murdered 289 prisoners in 6 months, a homicidal maniac named Butcher Reed. The third one is a man who used to be a soldier, but is now the head of the Paradise Mercenary Regiment battlefield Lone Wolf Ingram. The butcher looked over to his side and looked at him like he was hungry. And finally, the last contender is an elite agent from the KGB, and her name is H7Z9. Xiang then looks over to the window of the arena and sees the spectators of this project. Mr. Hemingway then reveals to them that they've installed a chip inside him called Killer. The host of the game then advises the contenders to prepare and informs them that this game has no rules or limits. And those who survive till the end will receive a 50-year sentence deduction, $1 million, and a little bit of freedom. And now, the countdown begins. 3, 2, 1, fight! Xian observes the both of them. He thought that ordinary people wouldn't stand out in that scenario, so he carefully deduces that the game is disguised as a test. A test to show third parties just how much normal people are capable of after loading the type of the chip. It was an opportunity for Xian to get out of his current situation if his performance attracts the attention of a gold owner. Reed takes a closer look at Xian, thinking that the organizer is underestimating them. While Ingram was busy observing his surroundings, H7Z9 analyzed him carefully and noticed that he was holding a Colt M1991A1 and a magazine holster with 7 bullets inside. She thinks that maintaining a distance between 5 and 8 meters should be ideal, since she can prioritize the strongest to the weakest. H7Z9 looks at the Reed, thinking that if she could form an alliance with him, then they could attack from both flanks against the mercenary for a better chance of winning, but she doesn't know how to convince the butcher to team up with her. Reed suddenly proposes an idea to her, telling her to team up with each other so that they can get rid of the strongest opponent before the weakling. She asked Reed what he was planning to do. The plan he has thought of is to work together and disarm Ingram, and if one of them is unlucky enough to be shot in the middle of the fight, they will just surrender and accept their fate. She agrees with his plan and Reed counts down to begin the execution of the plan. Ingram prepares his gun, and Reed dashes and leaps towards Ingram. Ingram shoots at Reed and he falls to the ground. After that, H7Z9 slides to his side and Ingram shoots at her, but the bullet only grazes her cheek. She hurriedly takes hold of Ingram's arm and gun tightly to prevent him from shooting. Ingram takes his knife out of his pocket and tries to slash her, but she dodges in time. Then she twists around and Nelson holds Ingram from behind. While she was whispering in Ingram's ear, Reed was faking his death and suddenly appeared preparing to slash both of them. Reed mocks H7Z9 by saying that before accepting someone's invitation, she should think about it some more since there are no such things as good things in the world. When he was about to swing his chainsaw, suddenly, blood splattered across the arena with a knife stabbed through Reed's neck. It was Xian who mercilessly stabbed him. He took out the knife in his neck and Reed fell to the ground. Xian thought to himself that he was now indifferent and cruel to life since he had never done this type of thing before, and he thought that it felt wonderful. He thinks that the use of the chip will subtly affect the user's personality, and to his surprise, both of the remaining participants, Ingram and H7Z9, attack him at the same time. In a blink of an eye, he casually slashes them in mid-air with no sweat. Xian repents since he had no intention of taking away their lives, and after that, the outcome of the battle was decided. The last to stand was the financial genius from New York, Xian Shang. The spectators were amazed at him, and one of the spectators could not accept the outcome since Xian killed the big shots in the battlefield quite easily. The guy beside him explained that they gave Xian the knowledge and skills of the world's top-notch assassin John Chris with the use of a chip. He was also surprised that he could do that. It resulted in an ordinary person who has not undergone any professional training having as much potential as an expert after getting the chip. After the battle, they all gathered at one table, and the black-haired guy pities them since they don't realize the consequences of the rapid increase in technology and that this kind of technology must not be allowed to spread. And even if it means dealing with Cybercorp, he will do all he can to stop it. At the same time at the lab, Xian's chip was removed and he was immediately released. The scientist congratulates his performance, causing investors to make additional investments. To pay back in return, they told Xian that they decided to fulfill a wish of his as long as it wasn't excessive. Xian thinks of a wish and simply says that he just wants to eat at their staff cafeteria. The scientist was surprised because of his wish. Inside the staff's cafeteria, Xian is seen picking various foods to put on his plate, and the scientists murmur about him being the experimental subject that was sent by Cyber a while ago. The scientists pity Xian since he's currently an experimental subject. It won't be too long before he's thrown away. Xian turns his head and looks at the scientists listening to their conversation. The scientists are currently talking about trivial things and they suddenly notice Xian listening in on them. They leave the table while Xian is peacefully eating his food satisfied. It was his 5th day of getting access to the canteen and he figured out 3 things that he wanted to know the most. The first is that the laboratory is located on an isolated island in the heart of the Pacific Ocean. The base is totally closed to the outside world, and the active staff have only 2 rotational appearances every year. Second, the laboratory is asking its partners for experimental subjects at the frequency of changing a batch of experimental materials every 2 months. The eliminated experimental subjects were held uniformly somewhere at the base for some kind of quote-unquote treatment. Third, the relationship between the laboratory and Cybercorp is more complex than previously thought by Xian Shang. The relationship between them is not a relationship. But instead, Cyber is the backstage financial backer of the laboratory, but there is more than one financial backer. Xiang thinks that there's nothing wrong with the previous assumptions for the researchers since the experimental subjects are consumables, but he doesn't know about the frequent replacement of experimental subjects. After realizing those 3 things, his situation is no longer favorable for him: an inescapable Pacific island, unknown hidden dangers, and the sword of Damocles hanging overhead. These are reasons that urge him to break free of the situation as soon as possible. In this way, Xian Shang racked his brain to find a way while accompanied in his 13th afternoon in the laboratory. His investigation currently has no progress at all and he thinks that he could only count on those people to help him. His performance that day was only a temporary addition. But thanks to the show, he had a chance to get out, and now the financial backers must realize the full potential of the chips and the risks they will cause when the technology spreads. The wise man who realizes what this technology will bring to the world is bound to find ways to prevent it from spreading. As Xian stares at the window, he thinks that a certain someone should have acted already. Not too far away from the island, a helicopter can be seen flying towards the laboratory with armed mercenaries inside that are hired by an employer. The plan was for them to take the relevant researchers and destroy the project information within 2 hours. After eating his lunch, His collar turns red and beeps, telling them that lunch break is over and they shall move to Area D. Suddenly, the ground shakes and a wall has been breached in the laboratory. The mercenaries are split apart in different parts of the island. It was Squad C who breached Area C of the laboratory. The alarm rings and announces for staff to evacuate immediately. Cien pulls off a light Yagami face, and at the other part of the laboratory, the mercenaries engage in a skirmish with the guards while they ask for backup. The scientist, or previously seen as the spectator, is currently viewing the situation of the mercenaries inside the laboratory. He was distraught as even Area A was already breached. His phone rings and he picks it up. He receives a call from a person named James, who's another scientist, asking about the situation. He is nervous because almost every part of the laboratory has either been destroyed or lost control. James informed them that they would not be able to make it even if backup arrived, and that they should give up if all else failed. He then asked another scientist if the data deletion was complete, but the glasses guy told him to wait 30 seconds. On the other side of the laboratory, Cien is seen standing across the scientists who are running, thinking God must be on his side for this event to miraculously happen, and now that the invaders have taken all security down from the base, no one is going to stop him. At the chip storage room, two scientists can be seen hurriedly sorting the A-class chips and putting them inside the briefcase. Then suddenly, someone steps in and alerts the scientists. It was Cien holding an ID and a dead scientist. On the rooftop, the two scientists will be leaving the place with the use of a helicopter. They get in, and the moment the scientist relaxes, a mercenary holds a knife by his neck. A certain someone opens his eyes and sees Cien Shang in front of him. The certain someone was a scientist and he is currently tied to the chair so that he doesn't escape. Cien Shang tells him to give it up since he tied it really hard, and then the scientist wonders about the whereabouts of his friend, Jerry. Cien Shang points where he is using his eyes and glances towards the other side. The scientist looks and sees a puddle of blood flowing outside where the two scientists were already killed by him. The scientist suddenly gets mad while Cien asks him what he is so excited about and threatens to kill him if he doesn't listen. Cien tells him to carefully think about his actions since he still has a daughter to raise, asking him if he has the heart to let her spend a childhood without a father. The scientist asks him what he wants to do. Cien tells him two things. First is to tell the side effects of the chip. After that, on the rooftop, the scientist asks the mercenary who brought him here in the first place, and suddenly, the mercenary touches him in different places. He notices an object inside the coat and pulls it out. The mercenary tells the scientist not to play with him since the employer didn't ask them to take them back in one piece, and then he suddenly breaks the random gadget. And at another place, they've lost signal to the scientist, implying that the gadget used was a GPS, and a person on the computer tells the businessman the scientist couldn't be located anymore. Back to the scientist, after complying with Cien Shang's condition, Cien Shang asks him if he's telling the truth, and the scientist explains to him that he has no reason to lie and that long-term use of chips will cause personality cognitive impairment. The experimental subject before Cien was imprisoned underground because of a serious personality disorder, so Cien wonders if there's no solution, and then the scientist tells him that at this current moment there is no way to eradicate the side effects. All that they can do is delay the onset of the disease by strictly controlling the usage time and frequency of the chip. After thinking for some time, Cien tells the scientist to bring him to the place where they keep the experimental subjects. After they locate the place, the elevator entrance is currently guarded by two mercenaries. Cien thinks of a plan on how to get past them, and suddenly, both of them come towards the mercenaries and raise their hands to surrender. The mercenary was suspicious of them and told his partner to take a look at them. He told Cien and the scientist to not move and explain themselves, and both of them crouched down while the mercenary checks them. Cien peeks at the mercenary's gun, and while the mercenary goes on to the scientist, he dashes and tries grabbing his gun, but he sees Cien and immediately puts his finger on the gun. Then he gets kicked in the face. The mercenary's partner aims for him but gets shot in the head. After the confrontation, while they were in the elevator going underground, the scientist wondered how Cien did those since he doesn't have the killer chip. He explains it's because of his better memory since some things in his head are still not forgotten. The scientist says it's impossible, but Cien refutes it by saying that it's his innate skill that's different from others. At the lowest part of the laboratory in B4, They walk inside seeing various experimental subjects that were imprisoned. Xian shouts and introduces himself, but before he starts, everyone will be set free. That is all for part 1 for this manhwa. If you've enjoyed it, comment for another part, like, and subscribe. Love you all, have a good day and smell you later.